All living things are my prey. The undead are my allies. The night is my domain, and the dark, dank tomb my dwelling place. I feast on human blood. May be yours, so beware. Beware.
The vampire. It's the hardest working monster in movies and television. From horror films to young adult romance flicks, to comedies, to Japanese animation, the blood-sucking creature does it all. And of course, we all know there's one particular vampire who's more prolific than all of his peers.
Count Dracula.
Dracula holds the record for most film appearances by a single character at 170, and has been gracing the silver screen since the 1920s and 30s. Some notable modern portrayals of Dracula are those of Christopher Lee in the Hammer Dracula movies of the 50s and 60s, Gary Oldman in Bram Stoker's Dracula, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, and Luke Evans in Dracula Untold, which is most definitely not a part of Universal's Dark Universe. I don't know why you would think that, but shut up, it's not. Anyways, in this video, we're going to talk about the first 10 years of the Count's presence on film, and the story of the two landmark movies that declared his arrival as a cinema institution for at least the next century, 1922's Nosferatu and 1931's Dracula. The way that these two films portray, both visually and through their writing, the most famous vampire of all, continues to influence portrayals of the supernatural creature to this day. So, to begin exploring the narrative that binds these two very unique films, let's go to the common origin point of their story. The Count's story was, of course, published in its original form as the novel Dracula in 1896 by Bram Stoker. Stoker, an Irish novelist born in 1847, was deeply influenced by stories his mother told him, both of folklore passed down to her by her parents, and of the real-life horrors she had experienced during disease outbreaks in Europe. Dracula, whose original typescript reveals an initial title of The Undead, garnered a mixed reception upon release, being mostly dismissed as a shilling shocker. One review, taken from an 1897 edition of the Manchester Guardian, captures the lukewarm response well. The plot is too complicated for reproduction, but it says no little for the author's powers that in spite of its absurdities, the reader can follow the story with interest to the end. It is, however, an artistic mistake to fill a whole volume with horrors. A touch of the mysterious, the terrible, or the supernatural is infinitely more effective and credible. So, how did we get from a prevailing opinion that the work lacked subtlety to a state of affairs where the famous antagonist has been interpreted from every possible angle with fascination and fervor? Stanley Stepanek, professor of Slavic Studies at the University of Virginia, explains.
The novel, upon release, was only a moderate success in its day, nor was it even Stoker's most well-known work, mentioned only briefly in a 1912 obituary. But a critical copyright battle would completely change Dracula's fate and catapult the character into literary renown. In 1922, a German studio adapted the novel into the now classic silent film Nosferatu without paying royalties. Despite changes in character names and minor plot points, the parallels were obvious, and the studio was sued into bankruptcy. To prevent more plagiarism attempts,
Talk for a minute about some fundamentals of Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And generally speaking, Chapter 11 bankruptcies are usually associated with businesses.
Yes, it was Nosferatu that was responsible for catapulting Dracula to stardom and ultimately bringing about the financial ruin of the studio that produced it, Prana Film. Prana Film went bankrupt and curbed their vampthusiasm, so to speak, after a fascinating production phase and shoot so steeped in occult atmosphere and mystery that it is still spoken of in modern legend, but more on that later. Albin Grau, founder of Prana Film and noted believer in the supernatural, conceived Nosferatu out of a desire to create the world's first truly occult film. Grau generated copious amounts of unsettling concept art for the project, and worked with writers to loosely adapt Stoker's novel, despite never having the legal rights to it. Grau eventually brought the project to director F.W. Murnau, a former stage actor and World War I veteran who was on the cutting edge of the German Expressionist movement at the time. Murnau's body of work before Nosferatu included 7 films, all of which have been lost in part or in whole. However, one of the things we do know about those lost 7 films was that one of them was an adaptation of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde that saw the film debut of a certain up-and-coming Hungarian actor, one Bela Lugosi, who played a butler. Murnau accepted Grau's offer, and Nosferatu began shooting in 1921. Footage was shot in Slovakia for the castle and countryside scenes, and in Germany for scenes taking place in the city. The film was shot in black and white, but as a clever way of distinguishing between day and night scenes, a hand tinting process was applied to the film. Yellow for day, cool blue for night, and an orangish red for dusk. Here's a comparison between the black and white and tinted versions of the film. You can decide for yourself which one looks better. I prefer it tinted, but some people tend to think it's a little harsh on the eyes. Speaking of harsh on the eyes, let's address the horrible, spine-chilling, parasitic elephant in the room. Max Schreck's brilliant portrayal of Count Orlok, Nosferatu himself. Full disclosure, I've been afraid of Nosferatu ever since I was 6 or 7 years old and saw his little guest appearance on SpongeBob in the episode Graveyard Shift.
If that was you on the phone and you on the bus, then who was flickering the lights? Nosferatu!
Now, I've grown quite a bit since then, and I still shiver and glance over my shoulder when I see Nosferatu enter the frame. Undoubtedly inspired by Albin Grau's occult art of the character, Schreck portrays him as completely inhuman and repulsive. When he's on screen, there's an instinct to avert our eyes, to push away, to flee, to do something to make ourselves safe, because this is a bloodthirsty animal in front of us masquerading as a person. Orlok's fingers are talons, his fangs are needles, and his stature ensures that his shadow always looms over us. The difference between Nosferatu's head vampire and Dracula's can be measured by the degree of inhumanity present in each. When we look at Bela Lugosi, we see a man repressing his dark side. When we look at Max Schreck, we see a beast wearing a man's face as a mask. While the film was being shot on location in Slovakia, Albin Grau wrote the following.
The people watched the ghost-like pale figure of the Nosferatu actor with horror and shunned him like the devil.
From the moment that makeup artists transformed Max Schreck into Nosferatu, he began striking fear into the hearts of onlookers. His commanding presence is part of what has given the film its classic reputation and its longevity, along with its charming early special effects and brilliant use of shadow. But its critical reception upon release was lukewarm at best, and soon after its debut, Bram Stoker's widow brought the aforementioned lawsuit that would bankrupt Prana after only one feature film. Courts ordered that all copies of Nosferatu be destroyed, but luckily for us, some versions survived, and most modern cuts of the film, such as the one distributed by Kino Classics and endorsed by F.W. Murnau's estate, are stitched together from those copies that escaped the purge. Nosferatu, while vindicated by history as worth its copyright transgressions due to its artistic contributions, was obviously disastrous at the time for Bram Stoker's widow. The next logical step for Stoker's estate was to move to establish a condoned adaptation of the book in a different medium to both capitalize on the story's popularity and put the character in hands they trusted. Once again, we refer to the words of Professor Stepanek.
To prevent more plagiarism attempts, Stoker's widow decided to establish copyright over the stage version of Dracula by approving a production by family friend Hamilton Dean. Although Dean's adaptation made drastic cuts to the story, it became a classic, thanks largely to Bela Lugosi's performance on Broadway.
The Count's stage run is the connecting tissue between Nosferatu and Universal's Dracula. The Americanized image of Dracula began to take shape even before the stage show had made it to America proper, as Hamilton Dean's changes to the visual appearance of Dracula began all the way in the play's initial run in London. In Stoker's novel, Dracula is a grotesque and mustachioed elderly man. This bizarre image uses police sketch rendering technology to create a picture of Dracula based on Stoker's description of him in the novel, and the result is clearly nothing like how we picture him now. Dracula's soon-to-be iconic look, the cape, the slick-backed hair, the bow tie, was all developed by Dean using vaudeville magicians as a visual reference point, transferring their dress and body language onto the eponymous vampire to exude an air of mystery and to command the audience's attention. The notorious sex appeal and seductive nature of Count Dracula was infused into the character when the play moved to Broadway to please American audiences, and was boosted in no small part due to the talent and good looks of Hungarian actor Bela Lugosi. Universal had been considering a film adaptation of Dracula since the mid-1910s, but were reluctant to move forward with the project for multiple reasons. The first reason was the content. The erotic subtext and violence in the story was feared to be too much to get past the censors, much less to be a hit with mainstream audiences. The second was the expense, as after Nosferatu showed the world the character's power, Universal Studios began planning a big-budget version of the film that closely adapted Stoker's novel, a plan that went down the drain when the Great Depression hit. Thirdly, Universal president Carl Laemmle was lukewarm on horror movies as a genre, and so wasn't incredibly enthusiastic about the project. But luckily for us, the apple did fall far from the tree. Laemmle's son, Carl Laemmle Jr., loved horror films, and was the driving force at the studio behind many of the early macabre pictures they put out. So, once the success of the Broadway play became hard to ignore, Laemmle Jr. began pushing hard for the project to happen, and eventually became its producer. It might surprise people that in the early stages of the project, the Hungarian actor who had been living and breathing the role on stage was not his first, second, or even third choice. Laemmle Jr. pictured the project starring studio darling Lon Chaney, an actor so well known for his ability to transform into monsters of the silent era, he was called the Man of 1,000 Faces. Chaney would, unfortunately, die of cancer before production began, so we'll never know what his Dracula would have been like. But fortunately, makeup artist Rick Baker is willing to speculate for us.
I'm sure he would have done. I'm sure Chaney would have had much more elaborate makeup. He was into the makeup aspect of it. He was in, the Man of 1,000 Faces. He was always changing his look. I don't think he would have just gone with the light makeup with the dark lips. In the case of London After Midnight, he did all these pointy teeth and this permanent grin and these pulled down eyelids, which I think is a classic makeup. I have no clue. I would love to see what Chaney's version of Dracula would have been.
Once Chaney passed away, several other actors were considered for the part before Lugosi, who had to really advocate for himself to be chosen for the part. But eventually, and after agreeing to take a significant pay decrease as compared to the other actors, he was selected, and a few more actors migrated west from the Broadway stages to join Dracula as it took shape, including Dwight Frye and Edward Van Sloan, who played Renfield and Van Helsing respectively. The backdrop of the Great Depression was both a blessing and a curse for the movie, as it shrunk the budget and thus shifted the source material from the book to the stage play, But the rough economic conditions also meant that the escapism the film provided was valuable to moviegoers, increasing the possibility that Universal had a smash hit on their hands, and they most certainly did. Let's get this out of the way before we start singing the movie's praises. On a visual and technical level, Dracula is actually pretty mediocre. Its dialogue and the way characters interact with the space around them is just bland, and that's not only because of the budgetary constraints and the stage-bound source material. Director Todd Browning was renowned for his silent film work, but his style didn't carry over well to talkies. There are long, awkward periods of silence that many attribute to Browning's lack of familiarity or comfort with sound and sound equipment. These gaps have, to be fair, aged well, becoming in the eyes of most a charming part of the film's creepy atmosphere, but knowing Browning's reputation as a director, they seem like a crutch. Probably the most egregious flaw of the film is its lack of camera movement. Its moving shots, while well executed, thanks to Karl Freund, former F.W. Murnau collaborator and German expressionist cameraman, are rare, such as at the Seward Sanitarium and this 180-degree rotation around Renfield towards the beginning of the movie. Most of the film is like looking at a static shot of the Broadway production, being at its worst during this particular shot of two characters talking on a couch that lasts unbroken for 4 whole minutes. If you're interested in seeing a technically superior version of this movie, watch the Spanish language Dracula, which filmed on the same sets at night after the English production, watched the dailies, and learned from their mistakes. But despite meager technical merits, Dracula was a sensation, and that was because it broke the mold. Previously, when Hollywood was portraying a supernatural subject on film, the movie ended with a logical and comforting explanation. But Dracula was different because it made no bones about the supernatural nature of its story. In the famous words of Dennis Reynolds,
Now here's the twist, and there is a twist. We show it. We show all of it.
the script even went so far as to include an addendum live speech to be given by the character of Professor Van Helsing, performed by actor Edward Van Sloan at a limited number of screenings, where he asserted calmly and matter-of-factly to the audience,
"When you get home tonight and the lights are turned out and you're afraid to look behind the curtains and you dread to see a face appear at the window, well, just pull yourself together and remember, after all,
there are such things.
There are such things.
There are such things."
as vampires. It also smashed audiences' expectations of the representation of eroticism. The film was marketed as a dark romance, with posters like this one showing the handsome Lugosi spinning a web full of his female victims. On top of the mysterious, dashing Count's effect on women, there's also a homoerotic subtext, most clearly evident in this scene, where Dracula drives off his wives and claims an unconscious Renfield as his own. The original script even went further, calling for Dracula to swoop up the helpless man before biting him, in an image cultural historian David J. Scull has compared to the rape of Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. The only other film to find success by tapping into the taboo link between fear and desire in mainstream audiences' minds this well is Hitchcock's Psycho. It is, of course, Bela Lugosi's brilliant performance as Dracula himself that brings the film together and presents audiences with that razor's edge of danger and sensuality. While far less terrifying than Count Orlok, his cultural significance is far beyond anything Max Schreck achieved. Lugosi's thick Hungarian accent combined with his character's effect on women and his not-so-subtle aim of arriving in a country and draining it of its vitality left an indelible mark on an American public with a serious xenophobic streak. On set, Lugosi improvised the line,
I never drink. Why?
which became so popular that it was added to subsequent productions of the Broadway play. He became our society's default image of a vampire, his costume so iconic he was buried in his cape. His slow, methodical delivery, a result of line readings that were sometimes phonetic in nature, was powerful and menacing. Lugosi captured and continues to capture audiences' imaginations with his portrayal of a character simultaneously on the fringes of monstrosity and manhood, and how that man, or monster, brought the innate evil lurking in his foreign castle home to the shores of Western society. Earlier in this video essay, I mentioned that the production of Nosferatu was steeped in legend, and it was. It has inspired modern myths, including the movie Shadow of the Vampire, a piece of historical fiction that posits a realism-obsessed F.W. Murnau striking a bargain with an actual vampire who plays Count Orlok in exchange for victims. In this powerful monologue, a vampiric Max Schreck, who crew members have either dismissed as delusional or a really good method actor, reflects on the story of Count Dracula. I think it's a fitting conclusion to the story of how Counts Orlok and Dracula created together a cinema icon. Enjoy.
Count Dracula wouldn't say he couldn't remember.
I read that book. Murnau gave it to me.
Well, now, this is a golden opportunity. Speaking as a vampire, what do you make of the book's technical merits?
It made me sad.
Why sad?
Because Dracula had no servants.
I think you missed the point of the book, Count Orlok.
Dracula hasn't had servants in 400 years, and then a man comes to his ancestral home, and he must convince him that he is like the man. He has to feed him when he himself hasn't eaten food in centuries. Can he even remember how to buy bread, how to select cheese and wine? And then he remembers the rest of it. How to prepare a meal, how to make a bed. He remembers his past glory, his armies, his retainers, and what he is reduced to. The loneliest part of the book comes when the man accidentally sees Dracula setting his table.
But if you're so lonely, why don't you make more vampires?
I can't. I'm too old. Although I seem to remember I was never able to.
Then how did you become a vampire?
It was woman.
No, we're getting somewhere.
It's time to stop!